425 Park Avenue is a significant location. The prime location is Park Avenue itself, because it is probably unique in the world in terms of being an urban modernist creation. So it has a life, it has a scale, and the first thing that 425 has to do is contribute to that urbanity. Then secondarily, in the spirit of those individual buildings, Seagram, Lever House, Pepsi-Cola, now Olivetti, are individual buildings which have their own identity and which contribute to the public domain. So the second aspect of our design is that it should bring back something to the community in terms of public space, and beyond adding to the urbanity, respecting the sight lines, those planes which define Park Avenue, it should also have its own individual identity on the skyline. In the spirit of New York skyscrapers, and one can go back to Hugh Ferris, those extraordinary images, they're typified by setbacks. And here those setbacks are also working in terms of the kind of spaces that the developer, the patrons behind this project, can offer to the market. We're making the core compact, giving it its identity and articulating that from the main body of the space. That is working visually from the outside. It's working in terms of sustainability, and it's also creating much more flexible, manageable, appealing spaces. All these features come together to give it LEED Gold status. As I look back at the experience of the project as a competition, working with David and his colleagues at L&L, a great total team, as that team expands to embrace the city and to demonstrate the way in which this building, not just at the ground level in terms of the public domain and public space, but the way that it can contribute to the wider entity of the city. That's really exciting to look forward to. If I'm oversimplistic about office buildings in New York, and this is a very personal view, is that they fall really essentially into two categories. There are those which are, with exceptions and very honourable exceptions, the majority step in response to a 1916 legislation. The other kind are the exceptions, you might say. They reject the setback and they seek to find purer, more Bauhaus-like, simplistic forms. But it's quite interesting that these very, very pure buildings are a rejection of the step buildings that occur in the background of them. I think one could say that your building doesn't really, or your ambitions don't fit into either of those categories, because, as I understand it, what we're really striving for is a building that in the future will have a landmark status. It will be distinguished, but for very powerful reasons, it wants to be in the category of those buildings that step back. What are the significant differences between an as-of-right option, as envisaged in these models, and a new build option? We'll put this on top of this, and we'll take the two away. It's very much about the nature of the structure at the base. It's the quest for something which is more flexible, is more adaptable to future change, because it has fewer column interruption. Ideally, at the base of the building, you would like big footprints and you'd like tall space. In the mid part, something like 150 by 70 feet, you'd like a different kind of space. And when you start to get those extraordinary views over 300 feet out to the park and so forth, you're looking for the qualities that will be offered by a smaller footprint. From the outside, you really want to maintain that urbanity, the existing levels that works with the adjoining buildings, and indeed all the buildings in that area. The opportunity of celebrating the setback, in a way, is a kind of something that could emerge in terms of the relationship between design, market research, and marketing. And the way in which you increase insulation and performance, the way in which you can introduce a more beautiful, how can I say, treatment to this, may well generate a special product. And we have some ideas which we can elaborate on, which is very much about creating special units which will alternate between a kind of prismatic glass, which will be a sealed unit, not just a single sheet, for higher insulation, and which could alternate between clear glass, and then these reflect the light. So you could have very beautiful quality from the inside and an extraordinary quality from the outside, which is not just a kind of bland glass, kind of dumb greenhouse. I think it's much more subtle than that. So in this visualization, and you'll see further visualizations later, these become, in a way, quite subtle and combine the vertical and the 45 degrees. I forgot I did introduce this right at the last moment. I put the building in here. It fits very, very beautifully, and this in a way is reminding me that it's identifiable, but very, very much, for me, a New York building. I think to be distinguished and notable, this building doesn't have to indulge in a kind of look at me hysteria of sculptural shapes and so on. We feel that this expression of the grid and the 90-degree geometry is absolutely right for the building and for the neighborhood. Something triggered an awareness on our part, which was that most of our perception of this building had been really very much from this viewpoint, but the views from the east are quite significant. And also, whether that's the views to the building or the views out of the building. And you placed a very high priority on these corners here. The idea that they would be free of structure, because there was something magic about a corner, whether that was from the outside, but particularly from the inside. And during that conversation, we realized the possibility of reconfiguring the plan so that you could actually get corners which looked out eastward. We went back and we invoked this and other images of Hugh Ferris because we felt that there was a very, very strong New York thread through this building, whether that's Park Avenue, which is very special in all kinds of ways that we can talk about, in terms of the way that you preserve the frontage or its artistic heritage, but the setback, whether that's as of right or whether it's cultivated, and in a way Hugh Ferris encapsulated that. Now, of course, there's another line of thought that you could say, well, maybe it's more interesting to break with that and do something which is totally opposite, whatever the word is. And I think that the challenge of this building in terms of its exterior is, I think the balance is to be a New York building, a Park Avenue building, but at the same time to add something perhaps with some dimension which doesn't actually exist. How can you, without being indulgent or without being kitschy, how can you translate in today's terms something that will be a signature pinnacle to a building? If you did say that in terms of a collaboration with, say, James Turrell, in terms of lighting the base of this building, because that is in the public domain in the street, And then maybe if you extended the core structure out, you get the final progression down to 2 bays. But really what you need to do is at this point, your eye level is somewhere around that of a seagull or a helicopter, which is somewhere near the top of the building. And imagine that these, as fins, are very delicate colors, pastels, almost white, a hint of yellow, but they change over a 2 or 3 hour cycle. Suddenly, I'm not saying it's the final flourish or finish to the building, and it's an honorable building without it, but once you become, in a way, accustomed to seeing something like this, it suddenly looks as though it's sort of undressed as a building. And what happens here is that you do get the opportunity to express the continuity of that line of the facade. I didn't think this building should, in terms of its night lighting, be saying, hey, look at me, I'm standing out on Park. I felt that the lighting should be about the base of the building, the public domain there, and it should be about the summit of the building. Then I think that there's a possibility, whether it's office space or whether it's very special, for these terraces to give to be extraordinary spaces in the sky, which could combine landscaping and extraordinary views, the views which makes this city different from any other city. Although the building conforms to the street facade and in that respect respects the urbanity of Park, it also has its own very strong personality.
Good morning, everybody. It's really great to be here, finally. There's been a lot of planning that's gone on, and I certainly want to thank MAS. There probably couldn't be a better venue for us to be talking about our project at 425 Park Avenue. The project is going to require a lot more than a developer. It's going to require support from the community. It's going to require support from our investors. It's going to require support from the city. Something I like to think of as a grand collaboration of all of the stakeholders. We need to find a balance between our commercial interests as fiduciaries for our investors and for the community in building this timeless structure. As we move this project forward, you'll see outside some of the process that we went through, and I encourage you to go ahead and look at the display, not only on 425 Park, but on the other architects that have been involved in working with us. You can actually hear the architects, you can listen to them, there's iPads. It's really quite impressive. And it was a phenomenal experience for all of us to share 425 Park Avenue with those people. The first thing that's most important is the opportunity. And it's very important for everyone to understand what that is. For the first time in 47 years, there is going to be a vacant block front site on Park Avenue. Really the first time in most of our lifetimes, and quite frankly, I think it's going to be the last time in our lifetimes. The idea of getting a vacant building on Park Avenue is really quite extraordinary. So with this opportunity, as the developers, putting together this grand collaboration against a variety of headwinds and challenges, what we really needed to do was find an organization and an architect that not only shared our vision, but enhanced our vision. With all of the challenges and effort that goes into something, perhaps the most important thing is the human will that it will take to construct and develop this building. The will of the organization of L&L Holding Company, the will of Lord Foster and his organization, the amalgam of those two strong wills forged together in the steel that will rise out of this site. This morning now I'd like to introduce you again to my partner, friend, Lord Norman Foster.
Good morning. I'd like to share with you some of the influences on 425 and our proposals for the project. It starts, I guess, as the existing building in the mid-1950s. And this is the cover to the brochure of the time. And in the mid-50s, it talks breathlessly about the cutting-edge technology of air conditioning and fluorescent light tubes. And in a way, we can see the building there. And I would say that the first influence is the grid of New York and the streetscape, which transcends the architecture. And in a sense, all of the buildings here contribute to that space. And historically, and we were talking about this yesterday, this image of 1913. And although the buildings are different, the streetscape is essentially the same, except for the occasional landmark buildings. The church here has its own space, it sets back, and in that sense draws some attention to it with the space in front of it. But again, over time, and this is in the mid-50s, before the Pan Am building, but again, that extraordinary urbanity, the configuration of the pedestrian realm and the roads has changed. But what has not changed and is timeless is that grid, and a second influence, the way in which the buildings set back and give a richness to the skyline, and again, is unmistakably of New York. And I guess that we all have influences in our hero figures, and Hugh Ferris in the mid-30s kind of captured that with his graphite charcoal renderings, which was all about the sculptural effect of those setbacks. And again, coming closer in time to the Park Avenue of today, again, that consistent urbanity, except on occasions with the landmark building which will set back and which will create a public space, a civic space. And it's the fact that these happen occasionally, that they add the kind of spice to the otherwise, I wouldn't say anonymity of the civic spaces, the streets. And quite interestingly, I can remember over time the different installations of public contemporary art which have graced the forecourt of this wonderful Seagram building. And so if that idea of the civic space of creating a living room, but at the same time capturing the street edge, a kind of balancing act where we didn't want to set back, we wanted to preserve the edge of the street. So here what we're suggesting is that there is, as it were, a living room, a showcase for contemporary art, which will change perhaps every 6 months. Here, if you like, is the current exhibition of Calder. And here we can see it under a ceiling which is probably itself an installation by an artist to perhaps bring changing color to that, very, very gently kind of morphing over time. But here you see it's balancing that need for a public space, an enlargement of the public realm, and at the same time reinforcing the street edge. Now, The needs of the office market have changed over time, and in our conversations with David and his team, the desire to be able to provide not just a single type of space, but a rich mix of spaces, some of which are shallow, some of which are deeper. So here, there's a wonderful synergy between those civic responsibilities and the desire to produce something which will be almost unique on the market in terms of the quality and the variety of spaces that it will provide. So here at the base, the deep space, but I'll talk a little bit about that later. This is a combination of one of the many sketches and the wider team. So here we are. This must have been, looking at the date there, the 2nd of August. Well, that was when the sketch was done, and the meeting was round about that time. So here, in the process of evolving the design, is a kind of to and froing, advocating what as designers, from what we had heard, observed, and researched, we felt was appropriate for the project, and then being the good listener, understanding the needs that generate this building. And if those needs are not met, then the building doesn't happen. So, so in a way, the wider team, and here in that sketch, you can see repeated the street edge and then the building growing and relating in the public domain to the skyline. You can see our engineer, Roger Risdell-Smith, over there, and you can see the transfer of that structural engineering knowledge working in a totally integrated way to have the way in which 5 bays can become 4 bays, can become 3 bays as the structural load. So at the same time, woven into this, trying to find a high-performance structure, which in its own elegance will be doing more with less. And talking about the breakdown of those spaces, we have the low-rise, the mid-rise, and the high-rise, and quite a variety in that. Here we start to see the way in which a building is served by a core traditionally in the center. We move that to one side, we kind of stretch it out, so it's giving the maximum amount of flexible space. It's tapering to the top as the elevator needs diminish, and then it has a very clearly expressed structure, which is creating column-free spaces within those offices. And we extend the cores skywards as a final flourish, which will probably be a collaboration with an artist in terms of how those are interpreted on the night skyline. So really coming back and seeing that process as we have the structure which diminishes, the bays diminish, we have a degree of stiffening and triangulation. We celebrate those setbacks in the same historic manner as Hugh Ferris and those early 1930s renderings. And here you can see the shear walls of the core just gently extended. Talking a little bit about the flexibility of the spaces here. We're looking at the deeper spaces at the base, and then we're seeing the way in which they might adapt to different kinds of organizations, different lifestyles, different ways of working. How adaptable could they be? Could they take an auditorium, for example? And then as we move to the more shallow plates, and you can see the way in which the core, the back is adapting to that, and then exploring through modeling different ways in which different kinds of organizations could work, what the lifestyle might be, anticipating the needs in the future. And then the narrower floors, different kinds of layouts which might work with those. And then finally, reversing that, looking at it at night, seeing how, and I'll show you later, those spaces, the celebratory spaces might work in terms of providing kind of club facilities for the building. And again, always the clear verticality of the structure. What you're not seeing here is the different expression on the other side of it, which is much more in a kind of different spirit because it doesn't have the needs of glazing. And then eventually, of course, coming to the pinnacle of the building and marking that on the skyline. and then seeing how those spaces would work from the inside, mindful always that this building is a fusion of the internal needs, which are essentially private, and the external needs, which are in the public domain. And again, extraordinary views at these transfer levels, so celebrating the sculptural possibilities and the celebration of the way in which the bays diminish and the structure triangulates for strength at those vital junctions. And then this is the elevation to the core, very different, but again, in that very New York tradition, almost evocative in some ways of a past architecture. I can think of Rockefeller Center with the verticality of the glazing. And finally, on the skyline, from the distance, but still very much in that civic domain. Thank you very much.